I didn't ruin my life in one dramatic moment. There was no explosion, no scandal, no final goodbye that anyone remembers. I just stayed. And one day I realized my life had moved on without asking me if I wanted to come along. If you had met me 10 years ago, you wouldn't have thought anything was wrong. I had a job people respected. A relationship that looked stable from the outside. Friends who invited me places, even if I rarely went. I paid my bills on time. I smiled when expected. I said I'm fine so often that it stopped sounding like a lie. It became a habit. Like breathing shallowly, just enough to survive. The first thing I lost wasn't a person. It was time. Not the dramatic kind you notice disappearing, but the quiet hours that slip through your fingers because you're waiting for the right moment. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for courage. I told myself I was being patient, responsible, realistic. In truth, I was afraid. Afraid of making the wrong choice, so I made none at all. I remember the night it first occurred to me that something was wrong. I was sitting alone in my car, engine off, parked outside my apartment. I had been there for almost 20 minutes, scrolling on my phone, not because there was anything to see, but because going inside felt heavier than staying in that suspended moment. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and unwelcome, is this what I'm protecting? I brushed it off. Everyone has moments like that, I told myself. Everyone feels tired. Everyone doubts. But that thought didn't leave. It settled somewhere deep, like a stone dropped into water, slowly sinking until I couldn't see it anymore, but I could always feel its weight. I started to notice how often I said yes when I meant no. How often I stayed silent when something in me was screaming. At work, I watched opportunities pass me by because taking them would mean change, and change felt dangerous. In my relationship, I learned the art of emotional neutrality. I stopped arguing, not because things were fine, but because conflict required honesty, and honesty required admitting that I wasn't happy. The strange thing about quiet despair is that it's comfortable. It doesn't shock you. It doesn't wake you up in the middle of the night screaming. It tucks you in. It whispers that tomorrow will be better, that you'll deal with this later, that now is not the time. And so you wait. And wait. And wait. Years passed like that. I watched people around me grow. Change careers. Leave cities. Fall in love, fall apart, rebuild. I congratulated them, genuinely happy for them, while feeling like I was standing still in a room where everyone else was learning how to move. I told myself I was different. That stability mattered more to me. That risk wasn't my thing. That not everyone needs more. But late at night, when there was no one to perform for, I felt it, a low, constant grief for a life I wasn't living. The breaking point didn't come with tears or shouting. It came on an ordinary morning. I was brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection, when I suddenly couldn't recognize the person looking back at me. Not because I had changed so much, but because I hadn't changed at all. The same face. The same tired eyes. The same expression of quiet endurance. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years: if nothing changes, will I survive this life? The answer terrified me, because it wasn't a clear no. It was worse. It was, yes. And that's the problem. I realized then that survival had become my goal. Not living. Not choosing. Just enduring. I had built a life optimized for not falling apart, not for being alive. And the longer I stayed, the harder it became to imagine leaving. My habits were strong. My excuses were convincing. My fear was well trained. There was also guilt. Guilt for wanting more when I already had so much. Guilt for imagining a different life when others were struggling to survive. I told myself it would be selfish to want change. Immature. Ungrateful. So I stayed silent, even with myself. But silence has a cost. It starts to hollow you out. Slowly. Carefully. Until one day you realize you don't know what you want anymore, not because you've found peace, but because you've stopped asking. That was the moment I understood the truth I had been running from. I hadn't lost my life. I had handed it over, piece by piece, to comfort, fear, and the approval of people who didn't know me deeply enough to stop me. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I began to fantasize about disappearing. Not dying, just leaving. Waking up somewhere no one knew my name. Somewhere my past couldn't reach me. The fantasy scared me because it felt less like escape and more like honesty. Like my mind was finally admitting what my mouth never dared to say. I didn't act on it. Not yet. But something had shifted. The quiet despair that once soothed me started to itch. To burn. To demand answers. And for the first time in years, I felt something dangerous stirring beneath the numbness. Hope. Or maybe desperation. At that point, I couldn't tell the difference. Once the idea took root, it refused to stay quiet. I still went to work. Still answered messages. Still showed up where I was expected to be. But inside, something had cracked open, and through that crack, all the questions I had buried for years began to crawl out. I started noticing how scripted my days were. Wake up at the same time. Drink the same coffee. Take the same route. Say the same phrases. Even my thoughts felt recycled. It was as if my life had been put on autopilot years ago, and I had mistaken the absence of pain for happiness. At night, sleep stopped coming easily. I lay awake replaying moments I had dismissed as insignificant at the time, the job offer I declined because it felt too risky, the conversation I avoided because I didn't want to hurt anyone, the version of myself I kept postponing until I was older, braver, more prepared. That version never came. I realized I had been waiting for permission to live. The worst part wasn't regret. It was recognition. I saw how carefully I had built my own cage. No bars, no locks, just routines and rationalizations. From the outside, it looked like stability. From the inside, it felt like suffocation. And the most uncomfortable truth of all was this: no one had forced me into it. I had chosen this life every day by choosing nothing. I tried to fix things quietly at first. Small changes. Going to bed earlier. Reading self-help books I never finished. Telling myself I was working on myself. But these were surface adjustments, cosmetic repairs on a foundation that no longer held. Deep down, I knew what scared me wasn't failure. It was success. Because success would demand that I become someone new, and I had no idea who that was anymore. My relationship began to strain under the weight of my silence. They sensed my distance, even when I tried to hide it. We talked, but not about the real things. We argued about schedules, habits, misunderstandings, never about the truth that I felt like I was disappearing inside my own life. I didn't know how to say it without sounding cruel or ungrateful. So I said nothing, and silence did the damage for me. One evening, after a particularly empty conversation, I caught myself imagining what it would be like if I simply didn't come home. The thought wasn't dramatic. It was calm. Practical. Almost relieving. That frightened me more than any panic attack ever could. When the idea of vanishing feels peaceful, something inside you has already broken. I started walking at night, long aimless walks through streets I had known for years but never really seen. The city felt different when no one was watching me perform my role. I watched lights in windows, wondering how many people inside those rooms felt as lost as I did. I wondered how many of them were staying out of obligation, fear, or the quiet belief that this was as good as life was going to get. During one of those walks, I asked myself a question I had avoided my entire adult life: if I leave, Who am I without this life? There was no answer. Only fear. My identity was tied to my routines, my job, my relationship, my reliability. I was the dependable one. The stable one. The one who didn't cause trouble. Walking away felt like betrayal, not just of others, but of the version of myself I had spent years constructing. Who was I allowed to be if I stopped holding everything together? Days turned into weeks, and the pressure built quietly. I functioned, but it felt mechanical. Smiles became heavier. Conversations felt like echoes. Even joy, when it appeared, felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I wasn't depressed in the way people expect. I wasn't crying every day. I wasn't falling apart. I was worse. I was numb, aware, and trapped. The moral dilemma tore at me constantly. Was it right to leave a life that wasn't broken, just unfulfilling? Was wanting more a valid reason to dismantle something others would envy? I judged myself harshly for my dissatisfaction. I told myself I was weak, dramatic, ungrateful. But no amount of self-criticism made the feeling go away. Then came the night I stopped lying to myself. I was sitting alone, lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, when it hit me with terrifying clarity: if I stay, nothing will change. Not because change is impossible, but because I will never choose it here. The life I had built required me to remain the same. Quiet. Predictable. Contained. To grow would mean to disrupt, to disappoint, to risk being misunderstood. And I knew myself well enough to admit the truth: I would always choose peace over honesty in this environment. That realization felt like grief. Real grief. For the future I had imagined would somehow emerge on its own. For the time I had already lost. For the person I might have been if I had been braver sooner. I didn't make a decision that night. But I stopped pretending that staying was neutral. Staying was a choice. And it was costing me more than leaving ever could. The idea of escape stopped being a fantasy and started becoming a plan. Vague at first. Fragile. Something I was afraid to look at directly. But it was there, growing stronger with every day. I felt myself fading a little more. I began to understand that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is remain loyal to a life that no longer recognizes you. And once that truth settles in, there is no going back to sleep. I didn't leave in a moment of courage. I left in a moment of exhaustion. There was no dramatic confrontation, no speech, no slammed doors. Just a quiet morning where I realized I couldn't carry the weight of another identical day. I packed a bag with the bare minimum, not because I had planned it carefully, but because planning would have given fear time to talk me out of it. The hardest part wasn't deciding what to take. It was deciding what to abandon. I stood in that familiar space, looking at the life I had built, and felt a strange mix of grief and detachment. It was like saying goodbye to a version of myself that had tried its best but stayed too long. I didn't hate that person. I understood them. That made leaving even harder. I didn't explain myself properly. Not because I didn't care, but because there are truths that collapse under explanation. Anything I said would have sounded like an excuse or an accusation. So I chose silence, knowing it would hurt, knowing it would be misunderstood. That knowledge still sits heavy with me. When I walked away, the world didn't change. The street looked the same. People passed me without noticing. Cars moved, shops opened, life continued, indifferent to my internal collapse. That was both terrifying and freeing. My disappearance wasn't an event. It was a footnote. And somehow, that made it possible. The first days were the hardest. Not because I missed my old life, but because I had no structure to hide behind. Without routines, my thoughts grew louder. Regret crept in at night, asking if I had made a selfish mistake, if I had destroyed something that only needed patience. I questioned myself constantly. Freedom, it turns out, is not peaceful at first. It's disorienting. I moved through unfamiliar places, staying nowhere long enough to feel anchored. Each new room felt temporary, like I was borrowing someone else's life. I avoided mirrors, afraid of the person I might see looking back. Without my old identity, I felt fragile, undefined. Honest. There were moments when fear almost won. When the loneliness felt unbearable. When I considered going back, apologizing, reshaping myself into something smaller and safer. Those moments taught me something brutal: it's easier to endure quiet misery than to sit with uncertainty. But easier doesn't mean better. It just means familiar. Slowly, something unexpected happened. I began to feel again. Not happiness, not yet. But sensation. Sadness that felt sharp instead of dull. Moments of calm that didn't feel borrowed. Curiosity. The simple relief of waking up without immediately bracing myself for the day. I started asking myself questions I had avoided for years. Not what should I do, but what feels true. The answers were rarely convenient. Often uncomfortable. But they were mine. For the first time in a long time, my choices weren't reactions. They were deliberate. I thought often about the people I left behind. The confusion I caused. The pain my silence created. I don't justify it. I live with that weight. Starting over doesn't erase responsibility, it just shifts it. You carry your past with you, whether you stay or go. The difference is whether you let it define your future. One evening, sitting alone as the sun disappeared behind buildings I didn't recognize, I understood something that had taken me years to learn: staying can be an act of fear, and leaving can be an act of love. Not just for yourself, but for the life you refuse to keep suffocating. I didn't find a new identity overnight. I'm still searching. Still uncertain. Still rebuilding. But I'm present. And that, I've learned, is everything. Being present in your own life is a quiet rebellion against the years you spent absent. If there's one truth I've earned the right to say, it's this: no one comes to save you from the life you're tolerating. You either choose it every day, or you choose something else and accept the cost. There is no neutral ground. There is no waiting without consequence. I didn't leave to become someone extraordinary. I left to stop disappearing. And if you're listening to this, feeling that familiar ache of recognition, know this: it's not too late, because you're aware. Awareness is the first crack in the wall. What you do with it will shape the rest of your life. I let my life happen without me once. I won't make that mistake again.